Welcome to this special edition by Union Solidarity International. We're absolutely delighted to be joined on this Sunday by our great comrade, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, thanks for joining us today, my friend.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Yanis, I'd just like to begin today's conversation about the impending European elections. Of course, the European elections across Europe doesn't get a lot of attention, but a lot of us involved in the anti-fascist movement are increasingly concerned about the rise of the far right and the neo-Nazis across Europe. And it would be great for us to get an insight as to where we are in Greece with respect to the neo-Nazis, because, of course, a number of the leading politicians in Golden Dawn have been put in prison and pending trial, but of course that doesn't mean the situations went away, and far from it. Can you just give us an update, Yanis, with respect to the neo-Nazis in Greece?
Well, we must never forget that Greece is the frontline state in this battle for the soul and integrity of Europe, as I call it. Just like Spain in 1936 was the front line against in the fight against the Nazis and the fascists, as well as for the soul and integrity of Europe. Greece is now the front line. The situation in Greece is dire. Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi group, they pose absolutely no danger in terms of coming into government. They may score 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% in the European Parliament elections. The terrible reality, however, is that they don't have to be in government in order to be in power. In exactly the same way that UKIP in the United Kingdom does not have to be in government to influence immigration policy, both of the Labour Party and the Tories. Similarly, Golden Dawn can wreak havoc in the political agenda of the mainstream simply by being there, simply by operating disproportionately as a bulwark that shifts the whole of the political spectrum to the right. But let me say that these European Parliament elections have a bigger, darker force hiding behind the ugliness of the ultra-right. And that is the Austerian logic that Berlin is trying to impose upon Europeans, and to impose it with a major propaganda campaign to convince Europeans and Americans and Asians, the world at once, that the European crisis has been dealt with efficiently, it has been dealt with, and that now Europe is recovering because of the policies instituted. Joseph Goebbels used to say that if you want to tell a very big fib, what you do is you invert the truth and you keep repeating it. This is precisely what we have in Europe. The crisis is getting worse, and the powers that be are triumphantly celebrating its end. Our economies, our social economies are being torn apart. The North is pulled apart from the South. The Germans hate the Greeks hate the Germans. Very soon the Greeks will hate the Greeks, already it's happening, and the Germans will hate the Germans, just like we had in the 1930s and the 1940s. They created a desert with their austerity, mindless, misanthropic policies, and now they are calling it success.
Yanis, thanks for that contribution, and you won't be surprised to hear that I couldn't agree anymore with your comments. And I think one of the greatest, should I say, victories that those who are pursuing the austerity agenda have pulled over the eyes of many people in Europe through their partners in the mainstream media is this fallacy that the European economies are recovering. We see it within the United Kingdom as well, whereby we see the headline figures of 2% plus economic growth, and signs across Europe, according to them, that growth is happening. But of course, masked behind this is the increasing levels of unemployment and the crisis of standard of living across Europe. Yanis, I'm really interested to get your perspective on how the powers that be have been able to propagate the line that the European economies across the board are recovering, and how do we tackle that? How do we get the message out that this is in fact a fallacy?
Well, the only way to defeat darkness is to shine a bright light on it. And the bright light must be the light of truth. What the Berlin and Frankfurt and Brussels have been doing throughout the European Union in order to convince us that black is white and darkness is light is they are trying to create, quite successfully, a new financial bubble. Let me give you an example, because I mentioned that Greece is a frontline state. You know, it's a great guinea pig. All experiments begin there and then spread everywhere else in Europe, like the bailouts initially did. Now the bubble. Let me remind you that about a month ago, the Greek government, with great celebrations everywhere in Athens, in Brussels, everywhere, issued new bonds. It returned to the market. Suddenly, Greek debt began to be a tradable commodity again. And everybody celebrated, saying, see, it's the end of the crisis. Now, if you look more closely, you'll realize that it doesn't take a rocket scientist, indeed an economist, to work this out, that the Greek state remains more insolvent than it ever was. And yet, its debt is now selling, it's doing a roaring trade. Why? Because Berlin and Frankfurt are winking to investors, saying, look, you know that we know that you know that Greece is bankrupt. But these bonds, it's only 3 billion, it's nothing. Don't worry, buy them, and we will guarantee them. So that it can appear in the eyes of European voters that the Greek crisis is over. And if the Greek crisis is over, the European crisis is over. Now, this is a unique moment in history. You have a little state like Greece, which is more bankrupt than ever, and its debt sells like hotcakes. This is a paradox. It's not a paradox. It's the result of manipulation. It's a manipulation that takes place just before the Euro elections in order to pull the wool over Europe's eyes. And they do the same thing with Ireland. They do the same thing with Portugal. They do the same thing with Spain. I've been reading and rubbing my eyes reports that Spain has recovered and now its GDP is growing. This is both true and a huge lie. It is true in terms of real GDP. But if you look at what happens in reality on the ground, you'll find that in terms of euros, of the currency in people's pockets, the total income of Spain is shrinking. So how is GDP going up? Well, it's going up because of the trade crisis and the recession. We have deflation. Prices are shrinking too. And all that is happening is that prices are shrinking faster than income is. So in real terms, real income is going up. But that is catastrophic for the people of Spain, because it means that they are in the vortex of a debt deflationary spiral. Because when prices are falling and wages are falling, okay, prices and wages are falling, but your debt is not falling, your private debt, your mortgage debt, your debt as a nation. So you have less and less income with which to service increasing debts, because debts are not only falling, they're increasing because of interest. And they're celebrating this as a great success story for Spain. It's Goebbels. You take the truth, you invert it, and you keep repeating it. And this is what they're doing.
Yanis, absolutely fascinating contribution. And I remember as an economics student myself in days gone by that these are some of the fundamental tenets of economics which you're explaining, yet we have it penetrating the public consciousness that somehow the UK and the Eurozone is recovering, when in fact the situation is far from that. Yanis, how delicate is the situation from your perspective? Because over the last several years we've heard the contribution by people, including yourself, that we are at a tipping point in Europe. You've once again made those comments today, but yet the European economies seem to be, to the public, not falling into the vortex that you've described. Now, I would agree with you, and that is a sleight of hand and actually how the reality is presented. But how serious is the situation today? And do we believe those people in government that the situation is removed a little bit, somewhat, from the severity of a couple of years ago?
Look, all big lies are founded on important truths. So it's an important truth that the financial markets have stabilized. But it is a lie that that means that the economic crisis has ebbed. It hasn't. It has gotten worse. Now, what has happened is, as I said before, they've created a bubble in the financial markets. It's just, you know, a Ponzi growth of asset prices, of bond prices, of share prices, and so on. It's completely Ponzi. Now, that Ponzi scheme, you know, when the bubble grows, things look better. You know, this was, remember how things were before 2008? Everything looked fantastic. But it was Ponzi growth. Now they have created a kick, I call it Ponzi austerity. So through austerity, they've stabilized markets, right? And it looks as if it's stable. And it is much more stable. It is true that Italian yields on Italian debt have come down significantly, and that is obviously a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But underneath that, the real economies of Europe are being torn apart. There are centrifugal forces driving them apart. And remember what happens to Ponzi schemes? They collapse. So this Ponzi scheme, which has stabilized the financial markets, is not going to last. The thing with bubbles is that it's impossible to predict when they will burst, when it is certain that they will. When this Ponzi stability on the surface goes, we're going to have another financial panic. And not only will we have another financial panic, but the economies underneath that are sustaining finance are going to be far weaker. They will be far further apart from one another, and the peoples of Europe will be more disunited and more hateful of one another and of themselves than ever. This is a recipe for the European Union. I do not think that the European Union is sustainable. The way we're going, the European Union is not sustainable. And that is despite the epiphenomenal, epidermic surface calmness in the financial markets. Indeed, it is because of it. It's like, you know, a cancer patient. If you pump him with cortisone and he feels better, this is not making him better. It's making him worse because the tumor is eating away at his organs underneath. This is the state of Europe today.
Yanis, I've titled this conversation today with you "Depression in Europe." I think
pretty depressing.
What you have outlined is exactly a depression, not only in terms of an economic sense, but in a mental sense about the real severity of the crisis in Europe. And to take some of your words, thank you once again for helping to shine a light on the darkness, because it's very easy for people to believe the repetitive lies that become the truth, that the European economies are recovering because we see the simple 2% GDP rises, but underneath that is a far different story. And of course, we've had these conversations with you for a number of years, Yanis, about how we can pierce a light through this darkness and the depression in Europe. And I would just like to conclude the conversation by focusing perhaps once again on some of the points that you've been making now for a number of years and deserve to be repeated again today. From your perspective, how do we get ourselves out of this crisis?
Only through a reinvigoration of democracy. As long as the peoples of Europe are disenfranchised, apathetic, depressed psychologically, and defer to powers that be that are in the pockets of bankers, whose only chance of remaining bankers is to keep reaching into the pockets of the weakest members of society, there will be no way out. We need to remain optimistic that the peoples of Europe at some point are no longer going to take it, and they will convert their very clear discontent into the political action that will overturn the present state of affairs. It may take a month, it may take a year, it may take a century, but this is the only way it could happen. Alternatively, and that is not something I'm wishing for, Another 2008, more severe than 2008, is going to give the wheel of history another spin.
Yanis, thank you very much for participating in this conversation with USI, particularly on a Sunday when I know this is supposed to be a day of rest. Yanis, it only leaves me to thank you once again for your contribution, and we look forward to working with you over the years to come, because that's what it will take, my friend. We appreciate the scale of the challenge, but it is essential that we get more light in the darkness, and you're playing a very pivotal role in that, my friend. So thank you once again for participating.
And thanks to USI International for all the good work you do.
Thanks, comrade.